Certainly, one important goal of the education system is to help students develop the skills and knowledge that they will need to participate in the workforce. But I worry that many schools pay too little attention to another very important goal, to help students prepare for active participation as citizens in their communities. I believe this civic role of education is more important now than ever. With the rise of authoritarianism in the United States and around the world, there are growing attacks on reason, on truth, and on democracy. I believe that schools have an essential role to play in making sure that students develop their abilities to think critically, to respect reason, and to work well with people from diverse backgrounds so they can be thoughtful contributors to a pluralistic, democratic society. Since I have deep concerns about these issues, I was intrigued when I saw the title of Randi Weingarten's latest book, Why Fascists Fear Teachers. Randi has served as the president of the American Federation of Teachers since 2008, and she's been a prominent voice on a wide range of educational issues. In her latest book, she argues that teachers must play an important role, in her words, in teaching the vital habits of democracy and pluralism. As you listen to my conversation with Randi, I hope you'll reflect on the important role that schools and teachers play in a democratic society and what all of us can do to support them at a time when authoritarianism is on the rise and democratic values are under attack. Hi, Randi. Welcome to the Lifelong Kindergarten podcast.
I love it, Mitch, and I love the name.
Yeah, well, maybe we can talk more about that later. I do want to start with just some basic, conversation on education. I have a real appreciation for all of your efforts over the years to improve learning and education, particularly in public schools. But I know one of the real challenges is that there's not a strong consensus on the goals and purposes of education. And different people have different ideas about that, which can make change difficult. So just to start, I thought I'd ask, what do you see as the most important goals and purposes of education?
You mean all of the above is not the right answer?
Yeah, yes.
It's just, so I think what happened is if you go back to the founders, their view of education was to ensure that they had an educated citizenry. Now, they didn't believe that everybody deserved an education. It was basically, the white, gilded class, but, and basically men. But their sense was there was a connection between whether young people could critically think, could discern the difference between fact and fiction, and whether you could actually have the democracy that they fought so hard to get. And so that notion of civitas was a really important notion from the beginning. But then you kind of go, decades later, and you had this whole kind of push and pull between the Deweys and the Manns, the Horace Manns and the John Deweys, and those who thought about education as simply for job training and for occupation. And so, and we've never actually come to a nationwide consensus. So we have a long definition, and it gets me to, I think the purposes of education are to help every student, not some, but every student, be prepared for their lives, for college and career, and for civic engagement, for nation building.
Yeah.
And so
that makes,
it's a lot that we're supposed to do, but I think we have to do it all.
Yeah. And to me, I sometimes say that we need to help prepare people for their work lives, their civic lives, and their personal lives.
Exactly right.
But I sometimes worry that I think if I look at many schools today, they don't put enough emphasis on those civic lives, which, as you said, was there from the beginning. So,
and in fact, No Child Left Behind preferred the occupational focus. They would also say the college focus, but they squeezed out No Child Left Behind and the accountability testing because it was so focused on math and on English, it squeezed out social studies and the basis by which you had real inquiry and creative thinking and a sense of a cultural life and a sense of the civitas that you and I are talking about.
Yeah, I saw in your book, there's a quote that says that we have to teach the vital habits of democracy and pluralism. So maybe say a little more about what do you think are the essential ingredients to
Thank you.
help teach those vital habits? Yes.
So I think that, and this is part of the reason I love the name of your podcast, because a lot of those habits we start learning in pre-kindergarten and in kindergarten. In fact, parents are kids' first teachers in very, very, very fundamental ways. But when young people get into a group environment in pre-kindergarten or kindergarten, when we talk about the habits of democracy or pluralism, what we're really talking about is how you get a diverse group of young people, of children, who then have to learn how to listen to each other, have to work together, have to deal with each other when there are differences, have to try to come to common understandings, at least about how to operate in a school environment or a class environment. And then you get to that all of that is before you get to actual learning and instruction. So when I talk about the habits of democracy, what I'm talking about is how in a society that is actually governed by the people for the people, that means you don't have a hierarchical leadership. You actually have people working together. I'm not talking about young kids, but I'm talking about when they become adults, working together, operating together, living together, and making decisions together about what happens in their lives or the lives of the country. So that's why this notion of in a classroom learning the habits of that, of listening, of learning, of communicating, of working together, of understanding differences, tolerating differences, and being able to deal with conflict, all of that becomes really, really important.
Yeah. And I really like the idea that I think I hear you saying is they have to experience that in the classroom.
Exactly
So
right.
too often, civic education, if it's just about teaching about how laws are made and the things how government works, it seems to me so important to experience a democratic process,
I
in their
can't,
in their lives.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I am a civics teacher. I am an AP Gov teacher. I taught social studies. I taught law. The notion that you can learn civics simply by memorizing how a bill becomes a law or sing a song about it, or the notion that you can, memorize the three branches of government without actually experiencing what it takes to change society, make something different, actually, if you have a law, comply with it, build on it. It is all experiential. If it's only book learning, then people don't understand the fundamental importance of it or their role or agency in it. And so they opt out of it as if it's somebody else's problem or somebody else's issue, as opposed to in a democracy, we all have a stake in it.
And as we think about what type of sort of qualities and skills young people need to develop to become actively engaged in a democratic society, I know I've sometimes talked about, the goals of having young people develop as creative, curious, caring, and collaborative learners. And I think all of those are important, that they should sort of feel that they can make a difference in the world and they can create and they can explore and experiment. But actually, I realize one thing that's not in there that you really emphasize in your writings is the critical thinking. So it's
Right.
not just creative, curious, caring, and collaborative, but critical thinking and how essential that is. Uh, for participating in a democratic society. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
I think that the all of what you just said, I just wrote them down myself. Creative, curious, collaborative, being a good communication. All of those things are important in terms of, um, if you have an empty field and that you're starting, if you're an artist and you start to build a painting, or if you're an architect, you start to build a building, or a farmer, what 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 I think about, the reason I think about critical thinking is I think about the issues of problem solving, and how that kind of, how do people start thinking about if there's a conflict, or if there's something that they don't know how to solve, what are the habits that they need? What are the skills that they need to be able to get to a conclusion, a solution? And what critical thinking is, if you looked at, all those pieces of journalism, like if you're telling a story, the when, the where, the who, I think the how, I think about the why, because what the why is, it makes you go to the next step about what happened and why, and discerning somebody else's place in it, or decisions about it. So all of those things are important, but what problem solving, applying knowledge, and critical thinking does is it actually gives you the skills when something is not easy, when there is an impediment in front of you, when you trip and fall, when there are two things that look equally intriguing, and how do you make a decision? So it becomes the kind of thing we have to do as adults if we want to actually, have a future that's better than the current.
Yeah. And for me, also, sometimes I frame it in terms of the importance of kids developing a sense of agency, where they have the sort of the
Exactly.
ability and the confidence to do things, to be able to tackle new problems. And this is something that
Exactly.
I think is especially important with the political situation today, where there's a risk with authoritarian governments of reducing the agency, or restricting the opportunities
In
for.
some ways, Mitch, I don't mean to interrupt you. You're so right that it's not, it's, I used to think about it as simply engagement, but it is that agency. It is that confidence. It is that sense that, the world is a pretty complicated place. And and you have to, in order to be successful in the world, you have to navigate those complexities, but you have to have the skills to be able to do it. And critical thinking and problem solving give you those skills.
Obviously, one thing that you think a lot about is what's the role of teachers in supporting children developing the agency, developing the creative thinking. Maybe you can say a little about how to think about the special roles that teachers need to
Mhm.
play in supporting young people in developing those qualities and abilities.
So it's interesting. I'm gonna start this in a very unusual way, because in the current conversation, like when Melania Trump was in the White House with one of those one of those humanoids, one of those robots, and she walked down, one of those red carpets with that robot.
Yeah.
The reaction to it universally was really negative. And we there's a teacher who I know very well, who's been teaching for 20, 25 years, teaches a 11th and 12th grade history class. So she asked all of her kids what they thought about robot teaching, and all of them said hate it. When you ask man on the street, people say hate it. So it's this sense that people get, whether you're a teacher or not, and this is Teacher Appreciation Week, that kids need human beings in their lives.
Yeah.
And they need human beings at really important junctures of their lives. And I would say every grade in education is a pretty important juncture. You know, the difference between 3 and 5 is huge. Between 6 and 10 is also huge. Every day in adolescence is huge. So when you have a human being in front of a classroom who you as a student knows is watching your cues, is thinking about how to react to what you're doing, is actually on your side, helping you become the adult you need to become, uh, helping you when you trip, praising you when you do well. All of that is about the development of human beings. And a robot, at one point or another, I'm sure AI is going to be able to train a robot to do many of these cues, but it's really different than a human being and that human dimension and that kind of connection. And
Yeah.
people need that connection. And teachers, there's not a teacher I know who doesn't understand that first and foremost, your job is to create a welcome and safe environment for young people. And then your second job is to teach. So when people then say, oh no, it's about reading, writing, arithmetic. No, of course it's about that, but it's about making sure that kids feel a sense of themselves first. And that's the human dynamic and the human connection. And no robot is going to have the same kind of cues as when a teacher and a student lock eyes together and there is a sense of that connection.
Yeah, but totally agree. And a lot of times with sort of all the, interest with artificial intelligence, when people think about the problems, they often point to kids cheating or inaccuracies or biases, and those are real problems. But to me, a much bigger problem is undermining and undervaluing the role of the human. Um,
Exactly
and
right.
and obviously understanding the importance of sharing a lived experience, being able
Exactly
to
right.
bring together a community of people. So it's not just about delivering instruction. But officially delivering instruction, you can automate. But I do worry that sometimes the way people think about teaching could get, pushed to thinking about it's just about efficient delivering of instruction. And as you were saying, it's not that at all.
Exactly. I mean, it is this sense of, often how many of us um, think about that aha moment. I know it feels a little bit silly sometimes, but when you have a class of kids who you see either individually or collectively, then they understand, they absorb, and then they build on um, a piece of knowledge. That application, that's teaching. That it's not the memorization. It's not memorizing a multiplication table. It's not memorizing, what you do grammatically. It is the sense of wow. It's a sense of some creative moment of I get that. I can build on that. That's what teachers live for. And you want to help kids have the skills and knowledge they need, as you said before, to live their lives, to live their best lives. And that requires a human dimension. After the Melania Trump experience, I went to social media to the teacher threads on Threads, and I love that, and I just watch people tease about, oh, so what's the robot going to do when kids are throwing milk cartons at each other? And and yes, we have to deal with how to use AI. We have to deal with when it's appropriate for kids to have it. We have to deal with disinformation, misinformation. We can't be Luddites about, we have a role to play given that this is a new technology. But the substitution, the replacement of, and if I may say, those chat bots that basically act as friends to kids
Yeah.
and are are trained, are coded to just say things that, that gets a kid more and more into it, and it's not real life. It's very dangerous.
Maybe I want to touch upon, I know you also focus a lot on the importance of public schools in particular. And something that also is very special to me, my grandparents were immigrants from Eastern Europe. I know your family also came from Eastern Europe. And my grandparents arrived with no money, no knowledge of the language. And it was only because of public schooling that my parents were able to get integrated into society and lead the lives that they lived, and then made it possible for me to live those lives. So, May, if you can talk some about, I know you talked about the importance for reaching all kids and welcoming for children from all backgrounds. And I do think that's a special role in public education. And I know you've been such a strong advocate for that.
So, there, I want to also say it first. If a parent wants to send their kids to a Roman Catholic school or a Jewish school, or they have a particular way that they are educating kids, you know, I'm not going to substitute my judgment as another human being for that parent's judgment. I mean, in school, teachers are in locus parentis. And, there are laws on the books about ensuring that, that kids are special, and, you know, and their best interest has to be minded to, and that is a government responsibility. But I want to be very careful that if somebody wants to, they have that right to do it. My job as both a teacher, as a believer in public schools, and as the head of the AFT, my job is to make sure that we strengthen, not abandon public education, because public education it's a very special right in the United States, but it is a so it's really important as that right, and is a foundation stone for both democracy, but for also the sense in the United States of equal opportunity, of opportunity for all. And so by providing, as the court required in Brown versus Board of Education, an education for all kids, not a separate education, but a pluralistic, integrated education, a promise of that for all young people. What we said in the 1950s on was that our Constitution required that we ensure that we provide all kids that opportunity. And so we have to make it real. Like, we have to make sure that in 2026, we fund it to ensure that kids are learn and have the confidence to navigate their lives, navigate college or, occupation, and navigate their civic lives. And so that means funding for it. That means creating systems and schools and classrooms that are safe and welcoming, ensuring that curriculum is relevant and engaging, so that we are successful in that. And so when somebody cuts out a library in a school, or an extracurricular activity in a school, or makes class sizes 50 or 60 because there's no money, or has a building that is leaking, or has terrible ventilation, we are not providing children the opportunity for them to actually navigate their own lives. So it's a long way of saying my job is to make sure that kids have the best shot possible, which means there has a certain amount of money that needs to be provided. We need to recruit and retain the best teachers we can, not just because they love kids, but because they also have the skills and knowledge they need to ensure that kids are successful. And so they don't take a vow of poverty when they become school teachers. They can actually live in the district in which they work and be members of a community. So nobody is looking for teachers to be billionaires. We are looking to make sure that schools, whether they are in the poorest communities or the richest communities, have what is needed to help all kids succeed.
Now, of course, trying to achieve that in schools has lots of challenges.
Right.
And unfortunately, there are lots of schools that don't live up to what you would hope for, what I'd hope for. I sometimes think that two things that we need to change, there are many things we need to change. And you said, of course, we need more funding, we need better support for teachers. I sometimes put it in terms of we need to change mindsets and change structures. A lot of the work I do is about trying to change mindsets, both
Right.
through things like this podcast, through books I might write. We have an online course for educators called Learning Creative Learning that shifts the way they think about the goals and purposes of learning. And the different technologies we develop is to help young people develop a different way of thinking about what learning is about. But there's also these challenges of structures. And this is where a lot of times I feel that we can't make much of a difference. But I know that you try to make a difference, but there are a lot of sometimes rigid structures in place that make it difficult to support young people becoming creative, critical, caring, collaborative learners. What strategies do you have, and what do you see as the biggest challenges? And then how do we help overcome some of the rigid structures that are in place to try to make it possible to meet those goals that we both have?
So that's that's a big question that I can answer simply, or we could spend another several hours answering it, which is that you need to have a combination of both a curiosity for innovation and, when things work, how to change systems to make the things that work the norm, not the exception. And we often, like I would say in the 1990s, we did a lot more of that than we did since 2000 and No Child Left Behind. In fact, so the accountability system right now actually is more determinative of the resistance to change than almost anything else. And one of the, I mean, it became controversial, but it was Al Shanker who actually had the idea of charter schools, because he wanted to try to see if we could spur innovation in smaller settings, in ways in which parents and teachers could work with each other. In the UFT contract for years, and they still do, we had something called school-based options, or different ways of actually trying to do things differently. If teachers and parents and principals could agree, so you had enough of a group of people agreeing, and you would change things in a school. So the last thing I would say is, we don't value that enough.
Yeah.
What we value is like taking the baseball bat or huge disruption, as opposed to what we don't what we need to understand is that kids need both stability and a way of, if something is a better way of doing things, how to make that the norm, not the exception.
And I do think there's an analogy that I think we both believe that kids need an environment where they can experiment, try new things, and explore. And that's how they're going to become creative and learn new things.
Exactly right.
And it's probably similar. We need schools to experiment and try new things as well. Of course, we have to make sure the stakes are high when the experiment doesn't work well. But as long as we protect against that, I do think
Yeah,
that
and
idea of experimenting and trying new things is so
and
important.
and I think that what we don't do is, because when something new fails, people get blamed, people get
Mm.
fired. There's no incentive to, or the incentives are actually in the exact opposite direction. But that's part of the reason why I am a big believer in project-based instruction. I watched it in the New York City public schools when we did the performance consortium schools, and where we saw that you could take away some regents and you could actually create a much more in-depth learning experience for kids, both collectively and individually. I mean, I remember, going to some of the young people's in their senior year to do their like something like a dissertation because they had that deep learning. I've also experienced that myself in teaching the We the People competition and being involved and engaged in these kind of competitions where your kids, compete against other schools. Ours did it around the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, but you could do it around robotics and around sports and so many other things. But the but but what I've seen, and this is in some ways the irony of ironies, that in career connected learning, what we call career tech ed, what a place that used to be so stigmatized, that there used to be such a value on college bound academic instruction as opposed to career connected learning or career instruction. But what young people do when they learn, whether to weld or to actually learn metronics or culinary arts, is that they are really pulling together applied learning, coming to a solution, problem solving. When they fail at something, they figure out how to make it different. So they learn the skills of resilience, of persistence, of problem solving. And then you see a result, a product, a project at the end of the line. And this has taught me a lot about how you can actually do far more innovation in schools. And I'm a big believer in us actually moving accountability from paper pencil tests to be much more aligned with project based instruction.
I think that aligns with. I'm a fan of alliteration, and we sometimes say we want to support the 4 Ps of creative learning, have kids work on projects based on their passions in collaboration with peers in a playful spirit. And the examples you were just giving seem like they hit all of those qualities, that
Exactly
it's
right.
project based, but also we've seen over and over that when kids are working on things they're passionate about, they care about, they'll work longer and harder, have this sort of persistence, based on that.
Exactly right.
And of course, the
I mean,
social dimension
passion,
of, yeah,
exactly. Look, I think you're right. When passion meets purpose, it's alchemy. And but that persistence, learning how to solve problems. If I can, I will join you in the P alliteration.
yeah,
All of this becomes really important, and learning when you stumble how to get up. That persistence is really important. And this is in some ways the difference in wealth. If you stumble and fall and your parents are well off, there's a safety net. If you stumble and fall and you're not well off, there's not a safety net. And it becomes even more important to learn persistence when you don't have those other safety nets.
to wrap up, I always like to
Right.
ask if you can give some advice. And maybe thinking about somebody who's just starting out as a teacher, and there are all sorts of challenges that teachers are facing and that schools are facing. What advice would you give to a new teacher for them to be able to you know to be able to to flourish in their own lives, but also to help their children flourish?
So I would, the first thing I would do, and I hope for any teacher who's watching this or listening, is express my deep gratitude for people going into our profession and wanting to go into our profession. The fact that people want to do this, it's not an easy job. You're as a teacher, you are essentially managing. I mean, how many adults manage 30 other adults or 25 other adults? Virtually no one. And you are managing in a classroom somewhere between 10 and 40 people, at many of whom, are different than adults because they have not developed the sense of right and wrong, or the yes and no and this and that. And so you are really managing a whole lot of young people who really need you, but those skills of management, those skills of knowledge, those skills of caring, of persistence, of sparking imagination, of combining purpose. I'm doing all the alliterations at the same time, purpose and passion. It's really hard and it's really important. So number one is just to express gratitude. Number two is to actually have a mentor, either someone who's been assigned to you. The best school districts, the best unions create kind of mentorship programs so that people actually have someone who helps them, who gives them lesson plans, who helps them know the rules of the road. That kind of mentorship is really, really important. Not an evaluation, but a mentorship. And the UFT, for example, in New York City, we have these teacher center programs all over so that there's someone around in a school to actually help you. So finding that help, not feeling shame or bad that you're trying to get that help, that's really important. And the third piece is to to know that you're going to be a better teacher your second and third and fourth year than you are your first year. And that first year is really, if you can hold on to those wow moments in the first year, if you can hold on to little things that actually help you persist, if you can start creating some routines for yourself that make it easier and easier, all of that is important. But that third piece is, hold on, what you're doing is really important. And just, there's going to be a whole lot of things that you're going to say, oh, I'm going to change that the next time I do it. But the fact that you want to do it, have somebody help you, and then really hold on and celebrate the little things that happen, that's my best advice.
And I'm going to add on one extra little piece, especially in light of your book, Why Fascists Fear Teachers. Special advice for the new teacher who's taking a job at a time of rising authoritarianism. And the advice you gave is important for all time. Any special advice you give in this moment of time?
That you are really, I often say to people, to teachers, our job is to teach kids how to think, not what to think. But you are working in a time that will actually decide the future of the country. And whether we as a country on our 250th birthday work through the problems of what it means to be a democracy and listen to each other and value we the people, or whether because of these problems and because of the huge wealth gap and all the other problems that we see, that whether this experiment of democratic decision making and freedom and opportunity for all, this experiment will fail. And we, as teachers in this moment, where all of society's challenges are visited on our classrooms every day, we have a really special role because of the connection of education and democracy.
Okay. Thank you so much, Randi. I really appreciate talking with you.
Thank you, Mitch. Really appreciate it.
The Lifelong Kindergarten podcast is produced by Mitchell Resnick and Eric Schelling in the Lifelong Kindergarten Research Group at the MIT Media Lab. You can find other episodes, additional resources, and online conversation in our Substack at bit.ly/LLK podcast.